Dr. Judson Brewer here. He's a New York Times best-selling author, a thought leader in the field of habit change and of the science of self-mastery. He has over 25 years of experience with mindfulness training and with his scientific research. The Director of Research and Innovation at the Mindfulness Center, an Associate Professor of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Psychiatry at the School of Public Health and Medicine at Brown University in Rhode Island. He's also Executive Medical Director of the Behavioral Health at ShareCare Inc. and a research affiliate at MIT. A psychiatrist and internationally known expert in mindfulness training for addictions, Dr. Brewer has developed and tested novel mindfulness programs for habit change, including both in-person and app-based treatments for smoking, emotional eating, and anxiety. He has also trained U.S. Olympic athletes and coaches and foreign government ministers, and his work has been featured in 60 Minutes. He's done a TED Talk, Time Magazine, Forbes, and others. So we are very fortunate to have him have the time to spend with us this morning to do that about unwinding anxiety cycles and breaking bad habits. When we were planning this conference, actually Dana Moncrief said, well, we really need to kind of address our own anxieties, not just the anxieties of our smokers and tobacco users. So I've asked Dr. Brewer to kind of talk about both of those, actually. And we will give you a warm welcome, Dr. Brewer. You're on.
Thanks for having me, and it's great to be here this morning with you all. We'll jump right in and start with some of the my financial disclosures. So some of the apps that I'll be talking about today are owned by ShareCare. All of that conflict of interest is managed by Brown University according to their conflict of interest policy. I also wrote a book called Unwinding Anxiety that outlines some of this stuff for which I receive royalties. And more importantly, as you can probably see, I am a cisgendered white male. So there are a number of levels of privilege that I carry through life, and a lot of ignorances that I don't know. So first off, I wanted to just highlight some resources that I found very helpful as a healthcare professional. For example, there was a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences just from a few years ago showing that nearly half of medical students and residents think that Black people have thicker skin than white people. It is not true. And that their pain tolerance is higher than white people, which is also not true, which affected their decision making. So it's really important for all of us, especially folks like me, to avail themselves of resources so they can learn what they don't know. And I'm just showing some of my favorite ones. A great book by Resmaa Menakem called My Grandmother's Hands. Shakil Chaudhry wrote a great book called Deep Diversity. There are many others out there, and there's a great podcast series out of Duke called Seeing White. So in case that's helpful for any of you, I certainly found those very, very helpful for me. Maybe I can start with a case study of a patient of mine. This was a gentleman who was about 40 years of age. When he came to see me, he was referred for anxiety. And I'm showing a picture of somebody driving on the highway, because what he started describing to me was that when he, over the last couple of years, before he started treatment, that he would drive on the highway and he felt like he was in a speeding bullet. And those thoughts got so distressing for him that he would start to have panic attacks, and then he would avoid driving on the highway. Long story short, he met all the criteria for panic disorder. He met all the criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. He probably had generalized anxiety for at least 20 years. And he was also very, very overweight. And I'll tell you why that's relevant in a minute. So, how do we treat folks like this gentleman who'd walked in my door? Well, as a psychiatrist, I'm showing you this cartoon that says, have you tried worrying about this? As the physician talks to the patient. With medications, there's this term, number needed to treat. It gives us a rough estimate of how well a medication works, or any treatment. That number for the best medication for anxiety is 5.2, meaning for every 5 patients I treat, only one of them is going to show a significant reduction in anxiety symptoms. So I'm basically playing the medication lottery as I'm prescribing medications for patients. How about for obesity? I learned in medical school, calories in versus calories out. That formula is still true today. But if you look at some of these obesity trends, this is a graph from 1985 to 2015. purple is not good. We are not moving in the right direction despite knowing what, quote unquote, the problem is. So I love this quote from Einstein, who says, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it, because in what we've been focusing on over the last half century is very much a willpower-based approach to anything, whether it's, it's the 5 days in tobacco cessation, and where I'm basically telling my patients, here are the things to do, just stop. I might be able to give them some medication to help with the with withdrawal, but basically, I'm really encouraging them to rely on their willpower. What about anxiety? Just stop worrying. What about overeating? Just, eat the salad instead of cake. Unfortunately, this doesn't really actually rely on how our brain works. So our prefrontal cortex, which seems to be most involved in self-control and willpower, et cetera, is the youngest and the weakest part of our brain from an evolutionary perspective. Ironically, it's the first that goes offline when we get stressed. What do we do when we get stressed? We smoke, we eat, we worry, et cetera. So what I'm going to suggest today is that we haven't really paid attention to how our brains work. And if we start paying attention to how our brains work, and even just learn a little bit about how our brains work, not only can we as healthcare practitioners be able to work with our own anxiety and stress, but we might be able to have a more empathetic and a better understanding of what our patients and what our clients are struggling with, so we can help them as well. So I'm going to give you a 4-minute primer on how the brain works, or at least the essential functions when it comes to breaking bad habits, forming good habits, and living a healthier life. Here we go.
Anxiety gone viral. Why fear and uncertainty spread anxiety through social contagion, and how to protect yourself. Anxiety is a strange beast. As a psychiatrist, I've learned that anxiety and its close cousin panic are both born from fear. As a behavioral neuroscientist, I know that fear's main evolutionary function is helping us survive. In fact, fear is the oldest survival mechanism we've got. Fear helps us learn to avoid dangerous situations in the future through a process called negative reinforcement. For example, if we step out into a busy street, turn our head and see a car coming right at us, we instinctively jump back onto the safety of the sidewalk. Evolution made this really simple for us. So simple that we only need 3 elements in situations like this to learn: an environmental cue, a behavior, and a result. In this case, walking up to a busy street cues us to look both ways before crossing. The result of not getting killed helps us remember to repeat the action again in the future. Sometime in the last million years, humans evolved a new layer on top of our more primitive survival brain, called the prefrontal cortex. Involved in creativity and planning, the prefrontal cortex helps us think and plan for the future. It predicts what will happen in the future based on past experience. If we don't have enough information, our prefrontal cortex lays out different scenarios about what might happen next, and guesses which will be most likely. It does this by running simulations based on previous events that are most similar. Enter anxiety. Anxiety is defined as a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Anxiety comes up when our prefrontal cortices don't have enough information to accurately predict the future. We saw this with the novel coronavirus that was discovered in China at the end of 2019, COVID-19. Scientists raced to study the characteristics of any new virus so that we can know precisely how contagious and deadly it is, and act accordingly. Uncertainty abounds. Without accurate information, it is easy for our brains to spin stories of fear and dread. In addition to being fueled by uncertainty, anxiety is also contagious. In psychology, the spread of emotion from one person to another is termed social contagion. Our own anxiety can be cued or triggered simply by talking to someone else who is anxious. Their fearful words are like a sneeze landing directly on our brain, emotionally infecting our prefrontal cortex and sending it out of control as it worries about everything from whether our family members will get sick to how our jobs will be affected. Wall Street is a great example of social contagion. We watch the stock market spike and crash, the stock indices being a thermometer for how feverish our collective anxiety is at any one moment. Wall Street even has something known as the Fear Index, which with coronavirus outstripped the financial meltdown of 2008. When we can't control our anxiety, that emotional fever spikes into panic. Panic is defined as sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety, often causing wildly unthinking behavior. Overwhelmed by uncertainty and fear of the future, the rational thinking parts of our brains go offline when we're panicked. Logically, we know that we don't need a 6-month supply of toilet paper, but when we see someone else's cart piled high, their anxiety infects us and we go into survival mode. So how do we not panic? Too many times I've seen my anxious clinic patients try to suppress or think themselves out of anxiety. Unfortunately, both willpower and reasoning rely on the prefrontal cortex, which isn't available at these critical moments. Instead, I start by teaching them how their brain works, so that they can see how uncertainty weakens the brain's ability to deal with stress, priming it for anxiety when fear hits.
Okay, so there's the 4-minute primer on how we get anxious and how it kind of taps into our old brain, the survival brain, where fear is helpful, and mixes that with our new brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's involved in thinking and planning. So fear is helpful, planning is helpful, but fear plus future, not so helpful. That's where we get anxiety and ironically turn our prefrontal cortex off. So, what do we tend to do when we do these types of things? There's this great Weight Watchers commercial from a couple of years ago that kind of highlights what we might turn to as coping mechanisms. This is a 1-minute commercial.
If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad because you're angry, feeling down, or generally bad, if you're sad, eat a snack. If you're bored and you know it, eat a snack. If you're lonely and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sleepy and you know it, if you're guilty and you know it, if you're stressed, eat a snack. If you're human and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack.
I love that. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad, if you know it and you know it, eat a snack. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack. So the reason I show you that commercial, not only is it pretty funny, they did a great job with that, but it really highlights this core mechanism of how our brains work, the survival mechanism called positive and negative reinforcement. So whether it's smoking, whether it's eating, whether it's worrying, there's a lot of research showing that this is the basis of habit formation. You saw from that animation, we need 3 elements to form a habit. This is the little more fleshed out version of this. And you can see that there's research dating back to the 1980s, or sorry, to the 1890s, showing that these processes can get set up. Eric Kandel won the Nobel Prize in the year 2000, showing that this is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. So as a scientist, I want to have a theoretical mechanism that I can test to see if I can affect it. And as a clinician, I want to kind of have an estimate of what's going on in somebody's brain, so I can look for those elements and potentially help them right at the mechanism. So, for example, with my patients with alcohol use disorder who struggle with drinking too much, there's this saying: people, places, and things. I learned this from one of my patients. They often talk about this in AA and other groups. If you avoid people, places, and things, you're less likely to drink. My patients say, duh, if I avoid the liquor store, the bar, my friends that drink, I'm less likely to drink. And we can see mechanistically how if we avoid cues, they're less likely to feed into the positive and negative affect that then drive craving, that then lead us to smoke or eat or worry or whatever. Now with smoking, as I'm sure you all know, it's hard to avoid all the places that we might habitually smoke, whether it's our car, outside of work, at home, et cetera. And so one of the strategies that I learned in residency was, substitute, eat some candy instead of smoking a cigarette. Problem is, this doesn't actually dismantle this core habit loop itself. You can see it treats around the behavior by substituting, but it doesn't actually work with the core craving itself. So, in a nutshell, this reward-based learning process, trigger, behavior, reward, or result, is really critical for driving behavior. And if we know how that works, we can, we can work with it in various ways. So, for example, as you saw from the Weight Watchers commercial, you can design food to be very addictive. There's a great New York Times Magazine expose from almost 10 years ago now that really highlighted all the ways that the food industry, which I'm sure many of you know, RJR NAB is the ticker tape symbol for RJ Reynolds Nabisco, because the two companies have merged. And so, if you're good at getting people to crave in one way, you can also take your engineers and get them to crave in another way. Of course, social media designed for the tweets, the likes, the retweets, the comments, all of that to help people stay on the platforms. So, a lot of people know a lot about how the brain works, and it's really, they use it in a way to get us to pay attention to their products, to eat too much, to smoke, et cetera, et cetera. So if we know how the brain works, why not work with the brain instead of fighting against it? And this is where my lab's been doing research for the last several decades. I use this cartoon of Waldo's, as Waldo finds himself. The idea here is, maybe awareness can help us work with this process. So, we've been studying mindfulness. Many of you may be familiar with some of the definitions like Jon Kabat-Zinn's, paying attention in the present moment on purpose and non-judgmentally. If we look at this from a mechanistic perspective, if you look at this reward-based learning system, it's, mindfulness is about paying attention. It's not about avoiding cues. It's not about substituting things. It's really about, some people describe this as bringing this wedge of awareness in so that we can see when we have an urge to smoke or to eat or whatever, and then be able to be with it, instead of habitually reacting, we can skillfully respond, and awareness can help us with that process. I'll give you an example. I had a patient who came to me who'd been smoking for about 40 years, and we calculated the number of times he had reinforced this process. Ready for this? It was roughly 293,000 times that he had reinforced this habit loop, and he had no idea how his mind worked. So what I do, and in our first smoking cessation randomized controlled trial, the first thing we did as we randomized people to get mindfulness training versus the American Lung Association's Freedom from Smoking program, in the mindfulness group, people didn't know what they were getting as they were randomized to the study, so that we could keep it free of bias as possible. We told people to go home and smoke. That was after the first group. And they looked at me like, wow, this is crazy. I'm in a smoking cessation program and you're telling me to smoke. I said, well, one twist on this, pay attention as you smoke. And so they went, they go home, and I still do this with my patients, go home, pay attention when you smoke. And of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And here's an example. This person said mindful smoking. So they're paying attention as they smoke. Smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yeah. So the paradox here is that paying attention may actually help us break really ingrained habits without force. And I'll get into the details of this in a minute, but just to put this onto the habit loop, we might be stressed, that triggers us to smoke or eat or whatever. And then if we pay attention to the reward, remember this is called reward-based learning. So the more rewarding it is, the more likely we are to do it. So the less rewarding it is, the more likely we are to not do it. And so the key there is to start paying attention to how rewarding it is. And again, I'll get into details in a minute. Or as Yogi Berra put it, you can observe a lot just by watching. Our first study, this is published now over 10 years ago, we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. So that was surprising to us. We didn't think it would work that well. And when we looked at the mechanism, we hypothesized that mindfulness would work by decoupling craving and smoking. So helping people be with that urge without acting on it. And what we've found, I'll skip through the math quickly, but for those of you that love math, you can read the full paper. As many of you know, there's strong correlation between craving and smoking, and we found that at baseline. Yet by 4 weeks of treatment, we found that correlation in the mindfulness group was completely abolished. And we found that it had nothing to do with baseline craving or number of cigarettes that people were smoking, but we found it had everything to do with people doing these short moments of mindfulness practice as they were smoking. This informal practice is formally moderated the decoupling of craving and smoking. So if you think about that from a mechanistic perspective, that wedge of awareness coming in, helping people be with the craving and not act on it. It's kind of like, if craving is a fire, you're not fueling that fire for that future round of craving. And that seems to be what we were observing. So it's really nice to see that it might actually target this loop at its core. Now, at the time, I was working at the VA hospital. We were on a smoke-free campus. I'd look out the window. My patients would be smoking in the parking lot. Started thinking, well, patients don't actually learn to smoke in my office, but they learn these habits in context. So could we start developing treatments to deliver those? Could I take my clinic and package it and give it to them? So back in 2012, we started playing with developing what are now called digital therapeutics. I think 5 years later, they coined that term, where we started developing apps to see if we could deliver, evidence-based treatments to people at their fingertips. You often see somebody out smoking, they've got their cigarette in one hand, and what do they have in their other hand? Their weapon of mass distraction, because they don't, cigarettes don't taste good. So we developed a program for smoking first called Craving to Quit, one then for eating, and then even one for anxiety. I'll go through how these work in a minute, but you might think, well, how is anxiety related to this habit loop that he's been talking about? In fact, there's a lot of research going back to the 1980s. Todd Borkovic and others showed that worry can drive anxiety through negative reinforcement. The unpleasant emotion of anxiety doesn't feel very good. Our brain says, make that go away. So we start worrying and we feel like we're in control, and that feeling of control feels better than that unpleasant thought or the emotion. The problem is that worrying actually doesn't feel very good itself. And so then it can start to feed back and drive anxiety. And then we go over the event horizon into this black hole of anxiety. And that was exactly what my patient was struggling with, where he was panicking and then he would avoid driving and was really, really struggling with that. So we can actually take these evidence-based treatments, instead of delivering them, we started delivering once a week, then twice a week. And then we said, well, if we're going to make a digital therapeutic, let's cut it into little bite-sized pieces so people can get training every day. So we can start with like 30 core modules, add in theme weeks after that work. We can help people understand how their mind works, link this to mindfulness practices that they can start practicing short moments many times throughout the day. These very short modules, 10 minutes a day, as compared to somebody having to commit, an hour to a treatment or get childcare or whatever. We can embed animations to drive key points home and make the understandings, really at a level that anybody can understand. We tend to aim for, 6th to 8th grade comprehension level. And we can give people in the moment exercises. So when they're struggling with a craving or when they're struggling with worrying, we can give them a practice to do right there in context. Of course, as a scientist, I want to know if this stuff actually works. So we can embed things like experience sampling so we can track progress and test efficacy. We also have the benefit of being able to pair this with live online communities so people can get peer support. We can even support them through expert guidance. And even once a week, I'll run a Zoom meeting with anybody using any of these apps where they can ask questions and we can dive into topics. So there are ways now with modern technology, to capitalize on things like Zoom, where we can help people all over the world. I just want to actually, in the interest of time, I'll skip through this slide. So I want to jump into, I'll just show some of the evidence for how some of these programs work. And then we'll get in, I'm going to give you a pragmatic 3-step process that you can play with if you have stress or anxiety. And then also you can start to kind of chew on and use this as a way to start to see how your patients might be struggling. So with our, with eating, as you saw from that animation or that video from the Weight Watchers, when we develop emotional eating, this is where a lot of unhealthy eating habits form. We wanted to see if we could help people break that cycle of overeating. Just like we could decouple craving and smoking, could we decouple craving and eating? So in a study led by Ashley Mason at UCSF, looking at craving related eating, she looked at our Eat Right Now app to see if could actually break that chain, and actually found a 40% reduction in craving related eating, and even a 35% reduction in eating to cope with negative emotions, which was really promising. Now, I, as a physician, never learned how to really cope with anxiety or stress in medical school. We were kind of told to armor up, kind of suppress our emotions, put everything aside, because all of that stuff was getting in the way of taking care of patients. I think it was a little over dramatic, but that was kind of the idea. So started looking at this anxiety epidemic and this burnout epidemic in the clinical world. It's not limited to physicians, but we started to ask questions like, hey, could we help physicians with their anxiety? And now this is important. In our study that we ran, we found that 60% of physicians had moderate to severe anxiety. So these GAD-7 scores that put them in the range of generalized anxiety disorder. Half of them felt that they were burnt out from their work at least a few times a week. A quarter of them felt this way every day. And about a third of them said they felt that they'd become more callous toward people since they took their jobs. So they're really losing that empathetic connection, depersonalizing, there are different words in the burnout literature that describe this. So we just asked a simple question, well, could we help physicians with anxiety? And we threw in a few burnout questions to see if that would help with burnout along the way, even though we didn't mention the word burnout anywhere in the study. So long story short, this you can look at the details. I think this was published in JMIR, mHealth, UHealth. We got a 57% reduction in anxiety at 3 months. Now, this was a relatively small single-arm trial, so we just wanted to see if there was a signal. It looked like there was a signal there, both at 1 and 3 months, with anxiety scores going down basically to minimal anxiety, which was really encouraging. And we also found a 50% reduction in certain aspects of burnout, like callousness, basically. We also saw a smaller level of drop in things like emotional exhaustion, because an app's not going to fix an institution, a system where people are overworked or whatnot, but it might help them conserve some of their energy. Now, as I mentioned, single arm trial, we wanted to see if this could actually work in randomized controlled trials. So we got some money from the NIMH, did a randomized controlled trial in people with generalized anxiety disorder, where we were trying to make this as clinically relevant as possible. So you can imagine somebody comes into the clinic, their physician says, well, we're trying this, this, and this, like medications, whatever. We're just going to add this on and see if it helps. So we kind of did an add-on study where we had usual care versus that plus the Unwinding Anxiety app. And we actually found a 67% reduction in anxiety at our primary endpoint, which was 2 months. And here, the number needed to treat was 1.6. So if you remember back to the beginning of talk, for medications, the number needed to treat was 5.2. So 1.6, I'd rather have 1.6 than 5.2. Now, the hallmark of science is reproducibility. We had 2 positive trials here. We also wanted to extend this to see if we could help people whose worry affected their sleep. This is a major problem. So I'm just going to skip through this mechanistic slide in the interest of time. We wanted to, so we recruited people. This is National Institutes on Aging funded study. We wanted to see if people whose anxiety contributed to sleep problems could be helped both with anxiety and sleep. Certainly in my clinic, a lot of my patients, when they try to go to sleep, their head hits the pillow and their brain starts spinning. They worry about tomorrow, and then they look at the clock and they worry that they're not getting sleep, and it just spirals out of control. So another randomized controlled trial where we looked first at anxiety. You can see at 2 months, there was a big differentiation between the active group and the control group. We got a 46% reduction in anxiety. But in 4 months, the control group caught up. So what happened there? Well, we did basically a within study replication. So at 2 months, we gave the control group the Unwinding Anxiety app. So we could look at two things. One, did the group that got the app first, did they maintain their gains at 4 months? And could we replicate our study with our control population? We found that both were true. So the group that got the app first showed that they maintained their gains at 4 months. And within 2 months, the control group caught up. Well, what about sleep? There are some NIH measures of sleep and anxiety that because it's so prevalent. So we actually found a 33% reduction in anxiety interfering with sleep at 2 months. You can see a big differentiation between the control group and the active group. And just like with anxiety, the control group caught up with the active group within 2 months, and the active group maintained their gains. So that's really encouraging in terms of the science. If we really start to look at how the brain works, this negative reinforcement can even drive anxiety. Can we target that to clinically meaningful effect? And the short answer is yes. So how does this actually work? Here's where we get into the pragmatics. And I think of this as 3 steps of habit change, whether it's anxiety or any other habit. I detail these steps in the Unwinding Anxiety book, but you can hear the Cliff Notes versions. And I'll go through these quickly, and then we'll give you some examples of each. So the first step is we've got to be aware of being caught up in a habit loop. Second step is we've got to explore, the results of the behavior. Remember, it's called reward-based learning for a reason, using simple questions like, what am I getting from this? Again, we'll get into the details in a minute. And then the third step is stepping out of the habit loop. I'm showing some examples of some of the mindfulness practices that we've used in these app-based trainings and our studies that can seem to be helpful for helping people break these cycles. So step 1, recognizing the habit loop. Here's an example of somebody using our eating program who said, I understand why I go to food, to avoid or cover up or distract from uncomfortable feelings such as anger, sadness, or restlessness. Who wants to feel those things? Trigger, uncomfortable feeling, behavior, eat something that temporarily diminishes the feeling. Rewards, still have to deal with the unpleasant feelings plus the sugar headache. I can clearly see how I got caught in this habit loop trying to escape difficult feelings with food, but that ultimately it doesn't work. So here's a great example of somebody mapping out their habit loop, but also hinting at the second step. So I think of step 2 as the beginning of the end. A little bit of neuroscience background here. There's a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex that stores and updates reward value in our brain. So think of it, I'll use a personal example. If I eat some milk chocolate and I eat some broccoli, my brain's going to compare those two so it can quickly decide in the future what decision to make, which one would I rather eat. So for most of our brains, chocolate is more calorie packed. So it says, oh yeah, I'll eat the chocolate. And then if I eat some dark chocolate, my brain will compare those and say, well, which would you prefer? So my brain chocolate, the hierarchy goes dark chocolate, then milk chocolate, then broccoli. You can see all the different behaviors that our brains, kind of categorize and then set up these habits around quick decision making. Well, this turns out to be really, really critical for not only forming habits, but also breaking habits. You don't need to worry about the details here, but there is some mathematical models that go back to the 1970s developed by Rescorla and Wagner, basically saying that the only way to change a habit is to change the reward value. And the only way to change the reward value is through what's this error term that's called a positive or negative prediction error. So for example, if I like chocolate cake and my brain has a certain reward value set up in there, my brain's gonna, if I see a new bakery in the neighborhood, my brain's gonna say, ooh, I wonder if they've got good chocolate cake. So if I go in there and I eat some chocolate cake and it is the most delicious chocolate cake I've ever had, my brain gives me what's called a positive prediction error. It had predicted that it would be good, but it was better than predicted. And that my brain says, ooh, remember that. So I lay down that memory so that I'm more likely to go back to that bakery. Now, if I walk in there, I eat the cake and I'm like, I've had better, then my brain gives me a negative prediction error and I'm less likely to eat it in the future because it says, I've had better. Now, the key is if I don't pay attention, let's say I'm eating the cake while I'm on the phone or thinking about something else, and then I go home and my wife asks me, hey, how's the cake? And I'm like, I don't know. Well, it couldn't have been really good or really bad, because that would have made me really pay attention. But I haven't laid down a new reward value for that cake. And that's how habits just get perpetuated. We don't pay attention when we overeat. We don't pay attention when we smoke a cigarette. And so we just keep that reward value going. So if we pay attention, we can update that reward value. And if it's not rewarding, we're less likely to do it in the future. Notice how that requires absolutely zero willpower. Notice how willpower is not in this equation at all. I'll give you some examples. Here's a study that my lab just published, led by one of my postdocs, Veronique Taylor, where we embedded this basically an awareness tool in our Eat Right Now app and had people pay attention as they overeat. And anybody using the app can use this tool. And you can see that as people use, within 10 to 15 times of somebody paying attention as they overate, that reward value dropped below zero and they shifted their behavior. So this was the first study we did in 38 individuals. We then went on to replicate that in a community population, over 1,000 people. And you can see that reward value drops relatively quickly when we pay attention. This makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective. We don't have time. We don't have the luxury to learn slowly when there's danger out there or when there's a really important food source. Our brains adapt pretty quickly. And this turns out to be the case when we pay attention to some of these old habits. If we formed one for 20 years, it doesn't take 20 years to unform it. Or as this person put it, dear sneaky habit loop that says eating junk food is fun. I am on to you. So that is the essence of step 2. Of course, we have a paper under review right now looking at smoking in the same way. Same thing is true. When you pay attention, realize that cigarettes taste like crap, that reward value drops and we can shift that behavior. Or as this person put it, today all the cigarettes I smoked were disgusting. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what the second step is. It's really about asking ourselves, what am I getting from this? And feeling into our feeling bodies, not in our thinking brains. Like, I know that cigarettes are bad for me. I know that I might get cancer down the road. Our thinking brain doesn't hold a candle to our feeling body. Our feeling body is much stronger than our thinking brain. And so that's where we go. We go to where our strengths are. Now, once we start to become disenchanted with some of these old habits through these negative prediction errors, we can then move to what I think of as the bigger, better offer, rewards that are more rewarding. So if we see, overeating doesn't really feel very good, or worrying doesn't actually help a situation, doesn't keep my family member safe, it doesn't help me think because I'm freaked out, that opens a space where we can say, okay, well, let's try something else and let's see if it's more rewarding. Remember, this habit loop, trigger, behavior, reward, is really critically dependent on that, how rewarding a behavior is. Now, if we look at some of these old habits, whether it's eating, worrying, smoking, could we actually replace these with something that is intrinsically rewarding? So I go back to Einstein here, where he says, I have no special talents, I'm only passionately curious. So could we actually substitute curiosity? Thinking, well, isn't that what mindfulness is all about? Yes, that's what mindfulness is all about, being curious instead of prejudging or saying, oh, this is bad, this is good. Just going, oh no, here's a craving, going, no, here's a craving. So we can actually open to our experience, turn toward it. And as that saying goes, the only way out is through. As we turn toward our experience, we learn that that's where our strength is. Here's an example of somebody using our anxiety program who said, when I first started the program, I didn't quite buy into the benefits of curiosity. Today, I felt a wave of panic, and instead of immediate dread or fear, my automatic response was, that's interesting. That took the wind right out of its sails. I wasn't just saying it was interesting, I actually felt it. I'm so thrilled. So there's an example of how we can tap into something that is intrinsically rewarding. And fortunately, curiosity only builds more curiosity because it's very rewarding. I can certainly say for myself, I feel like it's a superpower that we can tap into. I love this. There's a quote, I think, from James Stevens, the poet and the author, who said, curiosity will conquer fear even more than bravery will. So curiosity, very strong, super. We don't become habituated to it. All good stuff. Now, just to summarize all of this, and if you're interested in reading more details, we wrote a review article in the Perspectives of Psychological Science. When we look at these old habits, path A, this automatic habit, whether it's smoking, whether it's overeating, whether it's worrying, we just get stuck in it. We feel like there's no choice. It's depleting. So often, path B is this forced, just stop, just grit your teeth and bear with the craving, whether it's eating or smoking or whatever. That also feels pretty constricted and depleting. So, it might get us to our goals, but is there a third path that suggests that we don't need to grit our teeth? So when we have that urge to eat or smoke or whatever, can we actually get curious? And does that help us feel more expanded? Does that help us not deplete our energy? And what our data and other people's research suggests is that might actually be true. So, just to summarize this part of the talk quickly, we've trigger behavior reward is how our brains learn. This is an ancient system. It's how all habit loops are set up. Even social media, I'm sure we can all see all the different ways that we have everyday addictions. And what we would suggest is that mindfulness can actually target this process, and curious awareness can be that substitution. We can repurpose this habit loop, use and really just bring in curious awareness. It's not very complex. It's not necessarily easy, but it's not this complex process. It's not 10 things that we have to remember. It's one. It's really simply about being curious, being aware, and noticing, starting by mapping out these habit loops, noticing the results of our behaviors, and then seeing what curiosity itself feels like. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about a little bit of the neuroscience that we've been doing related to this, and then we'll finish up. So I'll start with a story. This is Lolo Jones, three-time Olympian, favored to win the Olympic hurdle specialist. And back in 2008, she had made it all the way through the preliminary rounds and into the finals of the 100-meter hurdles. In an interview with Time Magazine, she said something like, it was just in an amazing rhythm. It wasn't like she was in the lead at this point. And she was thinking, well, it wasn't like I'm winning the Olympic gold medal. It just felt like another race. And then I found myself telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out. So I over tried. That's when I hit the hurdle. And I'm highlighting this tragic story, is because this is unfortunately a great example of somebody getting in her own way. As this teacher said, your meat is in the way. And what I'm highlighting is that it's very easy to get caught up in our experience, whether it's getting caught up in thinking, for example, with daydreaming. We get caught up in daydreaming roughly 50% of waking life. Stress, we get caught up in stress. It's hard to tell ourselves, hey, just relax. We might even get more stressed. And at the far end of the spectrum is addiction, continued use despite adverse consequences, whether it's smoking, whether it's social media, texting, whatever, where we might even be aware of it, but we feel completely out of control. And that feeling of being caught up, there are plenty of studies showing this, but we can look at this from our own experience. It actually feels contracted. There's a study showing, where people feel fear and anxiety the most, it's in their chest. This makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective, because if you're in danger, your job is to make yourself as small as an object as possible from, the proverbial saber-toothed tiger, so we can protect our vital organs. Now, if we're caught up and we can feel this feeling of caught upness in our bodies, and if we're caught up at least 50% of waking life, we can actually start to measure what's going on in the brain. So there's a lot of work showing that being caught up involves the default mode network. Don't worry about the details here, but it's a network of brain regions involved in self-reference. And this network gets activated basically when we're thinking about ourselves in the past or future. As an example, this is a study of adolescents shown their own Instagram feeds, where the only manipulation was giving some of the pictures a bunch of likes and some of the pictures very few likes. And they found that this not only activated the reward centers in the brain, like the nucleus accumbens, but we're also activating these self-referential brain regions. And you can see here, one of the hubs of the default mode network is the posterior cingulate cortex. This gets activated, same deal with people who are addicted to cocaine, who are shown cocaine imagery. It lights up like a Christmas tree. Work done by Amy James at Harvard with people who are addicted to cigarettes, who are shown smoking imagery. You get the idea. Now, this also gets activated when we worry. And in fact, the more we worry, you can see in this orange, this orange area, the posterior cingulate, the more we worry, the more our default mode network gets activated. So why am I showing you all of this? Well, we were very interested in, how all of these studies converge. What about the self is processed in the posterior cingulate? And the hypothesis, our working hypothesis still today, is that this might get activated when we get caught up in our experience. And we can test this because the task of mindfulness training is to help us not get caught up in our experience. So in a study that we now published over 10 years ago, we looked at experienced versus novice meditators, looked at their brain activity when they were meditating. And lo and behold, we found that experienced meditators decreased brain activity in the default mode network when they were meditating. We didn't find any brain regions that were increased in activity, which was a little bit of a surprise to us. But in fact, it was kind of like their brains were relaxing, and they're like, oh, I don't need to worry about this. I don't need to think about myself. Or even if they had thoughts, they didn't get caught up in those thoughts. So that was interesting to see. And then we could then, in a prospective manner, we could do randomized controlled trials with people who were struggling to quit smoking. And we could see what happened to their brain networks, like the posterior cingulate cortex, when they were going through a smoking cessation program. So we did a randomized controlled trial. This was funded by NIDA, where we could bring, and this is in collaboration with Amy James and her great smoking cue paradigm. We could bring people in a baseline, show them smoking cues versus neutral stimuli, measure their brain activity and their default mode network. Then we could randomize them to get our Craving to Quit app or the National Cancer Institute's Quit Guide. And a month later, we could measure their brain activity to see if changes in brain activity could predict reductions in cigarettes. Long story short, we found a very strong correlation, and the R value here is 0.39, between reduction in posterior cingulate activity, shown here on the x-axis, and a reduction in cigarettes, shown here on the y-axis. Yet that was specific to the mindfulness training group. Only the Craving to Quit group showed that reduction. There was no correlation in the National Cancer Institute's app. And in fact, we found a dose-dependent response. The more modules they completed, the better they did. Whereas, unfortunately, there was no correlation with the National Cancer Institute's app. So this was, to me, this is kind of like the Holy Trinity, where we can bring together a theoretical mechanism, so mindfulness, with a brain mechanism, with the default mode network, and then also clinical outcomes, showing that mindfulness can target these brain regions, and that can predict reductions in cigarette. So that's as a scientist, it's really important to make sure I don't fool myself. As Feynman, Nobel Prize winning physicist who wrote these great books, very pithy books, he says, you as a scientist must not fool yourself. You're the easiest person to fool. So we started doing work with real-time neurofeedback, where we could give people feedback from their own brains in real time as they're meditating or as they're getting anxious, to see what's actually happening, to make sure that this brain activity is lining up with their subjective experience. We can also, and we were fortunate enough to have Anderson Cooper come in and try this out on camera for a piece he did for 60 minutes. And here's what he found.
This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical, exercise components down. And now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
Dr. Brewer is trying to understand how mindfulness can alter the functioning of the brain. He uses a cap lined with 128 electrodes.
We're going to start filling each of these 128 wells with conduction gel.
The electrodes are able to pick up signals from the posterior cingulate, part of a brain network linked to memory and emotion.
This is all just picking up electrical signal from the top of your head.
Since attending the mindfulness retreat, I'd been meditating daily and was curious to see if it had an impact on my brain.
We're going to have you start with thinking of something that was very anxiety-provoking for you.
Okay.
When I thought about something stressful, the cells in my brain's posterior cingulate immediately started firing, shown by the red lines that went off the chart on the computer screen.
Just drop into meditation.
Okay.
When I let go of those stressful thoughts and refocused on my breath, within seconds, the brain cells that had been firing quieted down, shown by the blue lines on the computer.
That's really fascinating to see like that.
Dr. Brewer believes everyone can train their brains to reach that blue mindfulness zone, but he says all the technology we're surrounded by makes it difficult.
So just to bring this to a close, you can see how these behavioral mechanisms can line up really nicely with these brain mechanisms. Whether it's Anderson Cooper or anybody else, we can notice, we can see how, our default mode network, for example, gets all fired up when we get caught up in worry. And we can also see how just bringing some curious awareness to that, what feels better to our brain, being worrying or being curious, what feels better, a craving or curiosity. To our brains, it's a no-brainer. So I'll just end by, you might wonder, well, how'd your patient do with anxiety? Of course, if he didn't do well, I probably wouldn't talk about him. It was really interesting, so with all of my patients, I will typically map out any habit loops that I am hearing just at intake, and work with them. So for example, at that first visit, I pulled out a blank piece of paper, just wrote down trigger, behavior, result. And I said, okay, let me get this straight. And remember, he'd come in, he had, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. And the trigger for him, just one of his habit loops, was around, panicking when he was on the highway. So the trigger would be these thoughts. The behavior would be to avoid driving on the highway. And then the reward was that he wouldn't have a panic attack. So I sent him home with our Unwinding Anxiety app and said, start mapping out your habit loops. He came back 2 weeks later. And the first thing he said to me, remember, this gentleman was about 180 pounds overweight. He said, hey, doc, I lost 14 pounds. And I scratched my head because I was thinking, I don't even think we had talked about weight loss yet. We're going to focus on anxiety. And he said, I was mapping out my anxiety habit loops. Anxiety was triggering me to eat. And I realized that eating wasn't actually fixing my anxiety. It was making me feel bad about myself because I know I'm overweight. So I just stopped doing that. And he went on to lose over 150 pounds. So that was pretty interesting, a nice little bonus. But he also, there was about 6 months into treatment as he was starting to apply these practices to his anxiety. I was walking out our School of Public Health at Brown is in Providence on Main Street. It's a pretty busy street. I was walking out of class one day onto the sidewalk, and this car pulls up, guy rolls down his window. It's my patient. I'm thinking, great, he's driving. Gives me this big smile. He goes, hey, doc, I'm an Uber driver now. Headed to the airport to pick somebody up. So he could go from, panicking on the highway to becoming an Uber driver, which I think is just really encouraging for all of us, that if we really learn how our brains work, we can work with them. Here's an example just to see how this can affect aspects of our lives. This person said, what's most interesting to me is how we define the rewards. In the past, the reward of eating right had been weight loss, but it was more often than not short-lived because I hadn't made real process changes in my daily life. Here, it feels like the reward is defined differently and weight loss is a side effect. The reward here is, for lack of a better expression, a more balanced life or inner peace. It's just lovely. So I'll just end with this great section of a poem from Rumi, The Worm's Waking, where he says, there's a worm addicted to eating grape leaves. Suddenly he wakes up, call it grace, whatever. Something wakes him and he is no longer a worm. He's the entire vineyard and the orchard too, the fruit, the trunks, a growing wisdom and joy that does not need to devour. And so what I hope you come away with, if nothing else from today, let me pause by saying, I want to thank all the folks that contributed to this work, including our funders, mostly the NIH. If you remember nothing else, just remember Mary Oliver's instructions for living. Pay attention, be astonished, right? Be curious, and tell about it. Share that with others. That joy of being with our experience rather than being caught up in it. So I will stop there. I've got a bunch of free resources on my website at thedrjudd.com. Also at the Mindfulness Center at Brown, if you're interested in learning more. And I will, we may have a few minutes for questions. So I will stop my screen share and we can move to those.
I will just kind of say thank you. And that was a wonderful talk. And I think we're giving you virtual applause. You can't hear it, but you know it's there. And I'll let Ashley kind of do the questions.
Yeah, so just want to echo, really great, powerful message, Dr. Brewer. And just wanted to, again, reiterate if anyone has any additional questions. We do have about 6 minutes left for questions. So just to read off a couple for you. So the first question we received is, would you consider mindfulness to be more about prevention or treatment?
Great question. Is mindfulness more about prevention or treatment? I would say yes. So in that sense, if we think of mindfulness as this awareness and curiosity, it can, if we're aware that we're starting to get into a habit or a behavioral pattern that might not be healthy for us, that awareness can help us prevent from really getting locked into to a habit, whether it's overthinking things, whether it's worrying or eating, whatever. So as it can certainly serve as a preventive tool, and as I mentioned with some of the studies from today's talk, certainly we see it as a treatment. When somebody's stuck in a habit, you can certainly use it as a way to help people get unstuck. So yes and yes.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have is, do you think modern technologies, smartphone, TV, radio, etc., have reduced our ability to pay attention to our actions, or have humans always struggled with paying attention?
Yeah, it's a great question. Have humans always struggled with paying attention, or has, these, as Cornel West puts it, these weapons of mass distraction, for example, our phones, but could be anything where we set an alert that can give us intermittent reinforcement. We don't know when we're going to get a text or an email. If we set those alerts up, that can kind of set us up for being caught in these things. I would say our brains have always had this capacity, and what the modern day technology has done is really capitalized on it. People have, there are thousands of people working as we speak to get us more addicted to these things, and they're going right to the basic neuroscience literature saying, what's the best way to get somebody addicted? Let's pull all of those levers. So we've always had that capacity. It's just that we've never had slot machines in our pockets before. And so as humans, for the folks that want us to have those in our pockets, they say, wow, this is the best way to get somebody addicted. And for we as consumers, we don't know what's happening. Suddenly, our phones are burning holes in our pockets and we don't know why. But our brains don't evolve as quickly as technology does. So the good news is, that can sound, well, I'm sure everybody knows the statistics. I think the average email goes unread 3 minutes in the United States, so if we set ourselves up for failure, we're going to fail, especially if we don't know how our brain works. And if we know how our brain works, we can work with our brain. And it really just takes awareness and practice, just like I talked about with those 3 steps.
Great, thank you. One additional question is, do you recommend using this strategy with children or youth? And if so, what age would you recommend introducing it?
Yeah, it's a great question. What age would I recommend introducing these types of strategies? So there are plenty of mindful schools programs, for example, that teach mindfulness at the elementary level. We've tested our apps with people as young as 13, with the basic concepts, and they seem to work. We even did a study led by Lori Piebert at UMass with adolescent smokers with the Craving to Quit app. So I would say mindfulness itself, it's funny because children are probably the best models of curiosity. We kind of unlearn it as adults. We're supposed to act like we know what's going on and, be in control and all this stuff, which ironically gets in the way of everything, including modeling good, curious behavior for our children. So I think we can look to our children and see that they already exhibit these things and just really help support them. So I would say, there's no age that's too young for us to be aware. There's no age that's too young for us to be curious. And in fact, this is unfortunately kind of a natural capacity that we all have. It's just a matter of supporting it as we get older and seeing that, wow, this is a good way to go, as compared to having to relearn it because we've beaten it out of ourselves.
Great, thank you. And our last question for today is, do you believe all mindfulness programs are equally effective, or is there a particular mindfulness program that works best?
Great question. Are all mindfulness programs equally effective, or is there one that works best? So not all are equally effective. It's kind of like not all therapists are equally effective. Some are better than others. There's certainly a bell curve, and not all medications. That's why people do studies to see which ones work the best. So here I would say, unfortunately, it's a pretty messy, tons of programs out there, whether they're in person, whether they're online, whether they're app-based mindfulness programs. So here I would say, right now, as people try to develop standards and try to be able to measure these things, there's a lot of research that's lacking, and there are very few evidence-based programs out there. I wrote a commentary for Psychiatric Times a little while ago just highlighting anxiety. Very, very few programs that are evidence-based. So I would say, unfortunately right now we've got to do our own research, which is not that easy to do. So much coming out, and especially folks that don't have time to do it or aren't scientists that can get through all the nitty gritty of a research study. It's really important to look for evidence base, especially if you're looking for a specific thing. In general, probably somebody wants to learn mindfulness, there are plenty of ways, plenty of things out there, but that's just kind of an overview. If you're really looking at something specific, I would say look for an evidence base. And it may take, we've done some work with our apps, obviously I'm biased, but that's what I try to do is, let's see, does something work? And if it doesn't work, let's make it better. If it does, let's do the randomized controlled trials to see how well it works. And hopefully others are doing the same.
Judson, I had a quick question, because in a lot of the mindfulness and previously the meditation kinds of perspectives, the breathing piece has been always a critical part of that, the deep breathing and kind of and I notice you kind of focus on the curiosity. Does the breathing still play a role in that? How do you see that kind of going together with mindfulness and meditation?
Yeah, it's a great question. The breathing is really a strong emphasis for a lot of programs. And in general, it's a great anchor. We all have to breathe. If we're not breathing, we have big problems. So it can be generally a neutral anchor. Ironically, for people who smoke, it might not be that neutral because smokers cough, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think about it theoretically, breathing isn't anything miraculously special. You can use any object as an anchor for the present moment. And also those are more of the formal meditation practices where it's like, I'm going to sit down, I got to pay attention to my breath. When my mind wanders, I'm going to bring it back. That's how I learned. That was one of the first practices that I learned. What we found in our first smoking study actually was that informal practices, as I showed from one of those slides, actually formally moderated, that decoupling. And so if you look more broadly than, like formal sitting meditation, like the breath, you can actually bring curiosity to any moment and notice when you have an urge. And that might actually work as well or better, especially in certain circumstances. So it's not necessarily just about breathing. Certainly can be a helpful anchor. Certainly for me, I hadn't quite understood why I was paying attention to my breath. And probably my teachers tried to beat it into my head, but I didn't quite understand that for quite some time. So once we understand why that's an anchor, we can also see, is that a good anchor for me? For some people, hearing sound is a good anchor. For some people, feeling the physical sensations in their body, like their feet or their hands, is a good anchor. So it really depends on the person, depends on the circumstances. So hopefully that gets at your question. Yes, breathing can be helpful. And there are, if we understand the concept, it's not just about the breath. It's about helping us see when our mind is wandering. It's like a boat that, you feel the wind blows it and there's an anchor and it's like, there's wind, there's a current.
Thank you. That's great. And thanks again for this wonderful